Last week, well, let's start with last weekend. Americans woke to the news of a horrific mass murder in Orlando, Florida. A gunman, a U.S. citizen, inspired by terrorists, legally purchased a weapon of war and turned it upon members of the LGBT community on Latin night at a nightclub in Orlando, Florida. 49 dead, 53 wounded. And senators returned from their home states last week to express thoughts and prayers, to observe moments of silence. And many of us resolved that while important, those were not enough. That we needed to follow up those thoughts, those prayers, those moments of silence with action. I joined my colleagues, a number of us, on the floor when Senator Murphy of Connecticut held the floor for 15 hours to draw attention to two common sense amendments that would have limited that easy access to a weapon of war by closing a loophole that allows so many of our firearms purchases to occur without a proper background check, and to close something we're calling the terror gap, which would allow the FBI the authority to deny gun purchases to people who had been on a watch list, suspected of connections with terrorism. Those measures gained a vote in the Senate last night, but both failed to advance. I don't think we can simply say that we tried and continue to accept shootings like the one in Orlando as the new normal, and then move on to other business. Especially, and I might add, our procedural posture right now, especially as the Senate has before us, at this period in time, the Commerce, Justice, Science Appropriations Bill, measure in which we can prioritize our response to this tragedy and the preceding tragedies through amendment and perfecting the measure before us. You know, Americans are demanding more. We can't just carry on as usual in the wake of these enormous, enormous domestic tragedies. Wisconsinites are demanding more. Just in this last week, I received heartbreaking communications from my constituents asking us to act. I wanted to briefly share two. A young mother wrote to me, "I am the young mother of two young children, and every day that they go to school, I say a silent prayer that they come home safely to me, that no one decides to walk into their school or onto their bus with a gun and an intent to kill." Another young person wrote to me, a quote from the letter, "As a young LGBTQ person, I'm devastated by this attack on my community. I'm scared that this attack happened in what was supposed to be a safe place. a free space in a world that is often hostile for LGBTQ people. I am scared for my safety and for the safety of my community. I am also angry. I am angry that the United States is the only country where shootings like this regularly occur. And I'm angry that our government is not doing enough to prevent this kind of violence. The attack in Orlando was, as I mentioned, an act that is allegedly inspired by maybe ISIL or other terrorist groups, but it was also an act of hate, a hate crime. And I've introduced an amendment with my colleagues, Senator Mikulski of Maryland and Senator Hirono of Hawaii, to increase funding to strengthen the prevention of hate crimes and then the enforcement of our hate crimes laws and our civil rights laws. The amendment is now co-sponsored by 18 other members of the United States Senate. I think it's really important to understand what a hate crime is. A hate crime is a crime, first off. There has to be an underlying criminal act. So it's not about hate thought or hate speech. It's about a crime wherein the victim of the crime or victims of the crime are targeted based on a particular characteristic. Sometimes we hear about hate crimes committed against the LGBT community based on sexual orientation or gender identity. But hate crimes are often perpetrated against people on the basis of religion or race or ethnicity or gender. Hate crimes targeted against people based on their characterization or their characteristics are done so because not only are the victims victimized, but it sends a message of terror and hate through a community, through all people who share characteristics with the victims, or who love people who share the characteristics of the victim. And they are terrifying. And they do deserve, as we have chosen to do in the United States of America, to be treated very specifically as hate crimes. It's only recently that the United States of America recognized hate crimes against members of the LGBT community or against women or against people with disabilities through the passage of the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. There are too many of these hate crimes in the news these days. We're still grieving the massive numbers of dead and injured in Orlando. But it was not all that long ago in Charleston, there was mass murder in a church. The African American community was targeted. In Wisconsin, in another place of worship, in a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, a gunman came and targeted the congregation during Sunday worship. Now, in America, hate crimes overall are declining, and that's good news, and that says something about what we can do together when we pass strong laws and try to prevent these crimes, educate, as well as enforce our laws. But I'm sad to share that while overall our hate crimes are declining, those against some groups, most notably Muslims and members of the LGBT community, are on the rise. LGBT people are more likely than any other group to be targeted for hate violence. And LGBT people of color, and particularly transgender women of color, are at the very greatest risk. So the amendment that I have offered along with my colleagues, Senator Mikulski and Senator Hirono, would provide in the Commerce, Justice, Science Appropriations Bill additional funding for the Civil Rights Division to focus on hate crimes prevention on one hand, but also enforcement and prosecution of those crimes when they occur. This amendment will provide important tools to the Justice Department that they need to combat discrimination and hatred in communities across this country. We're pleased to have a large number of human rights organizations in this country endorse this as an important step forward. We need to take action. We need to do more to address terrorism, to address gun violence, and to address hate crimes. And I urge my colleagues in the Senate to join me in calling for a vote on this amendment and supporting it when we get that opportunity.